Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the 11th John T. Dunlop Lecture. It's a pleasure to see all of you here tonight. We're in for, I think, a great treat, a truly wonderful speaker who I'll introduce in a few minutes. But I do want to start by saying, if the past few years haven't underscored the importance of housing to the national economy, who knew, to the global financial system, but also to our communities, to our citizenry, to the national wealth. The last few years have certainly underscored that, I think, for everyone. So we really sit at the Joint Center for Housing Studies at an intersection of an amazing time where the importance of housing, I think, has never been more real and visible to people. I'm Eric Belsky. I am the Managing Director of the Joint Center for Housing Studies and have the privilege to introduce a number of people who are going to welcome you here tonight and then to introduce our speaker. The first person I'd like to invite up is Raul Marotra, who is the chair of the Urban Planning and Design Department here at the Graduate School of Design and a leading urban designer. He's going to offer a few welcoming remarks for the design school. Thanks.
Thank you, Eric, and good evening to you all. On behalf of the Dean and the faculty of the GSD, I really, this is a warm welcome to you all, and for you to be here for this evening for the Dunlop Lecture. I want to particularly welcome the National Housing Endowment trustees and thank them for sponsoring the lecture, and the members of the Policy Advisory Board, and thank them for their engagement and support of the Joint Center for Housing Studies, which is really an important component of our sort of engagement here with cities and with the sort of world of the academy. So as you all perhaps know, the Joint Center of Housing Studies is a cross-disciplinary bridge between planning and policy, and a convener of dialogues that span the worlds of business, public policy, and the academy. And it's, I think, with this relationship to the Graduate School of Design that we really become aware of these questions and debates and have made them really high on our agenda. The Joint Center's involvement with the GSD has had an important bearing on design, and more importantly, the question of how a design school like ours can more meaningfully play a constructive role in this dialogue about cities and their futures. And we're sort of really aware of that, and we want to push that engagement much further. More pointedly, Harvard University's urban planning program is housed here at the GSD together with the urban design program in one department. And this Department of Urban Planning and Design is striving to see how, through the Joint Center, the Real Estate Initiative, and other partnerships, the design program can actually establish a renewed relationship and relationships to enrich the process of our engagement with cities, both here in the United States as well as around the world. The Joint Center has taken a lead in this process by very recently constituting its International Advisory Board and moving towards more firmly articulating and contributing to these questions of housing and the broader processes of urbanization in an international framework. And this is very exciting for us here because I think what this new thrust will create, I believe, is an enriched balance between both an intense engagement that they already have with the national and local conditions of housing in the United States and now the emergent global scene. In today's world, this simultaneous addressal of questions across this gamut is absolutely inescapable, and so we're really glad they're beginning to move in this direction too. And I thank Eric, and we've had dialogues, and we're hoping that this will go much further. The department here itself is also undergoing a process of recalibrating its own thrusts and priorities, both within the disciplines and how they're defined, in the way that they're defined, as well as our engagement with the local and global phenomena of urbanization. Our professions and disciplines are being challenged by the way the world, its cities, and their hinterlands are being rapidly reconfigured, and we have to train professionals who can engage with these places, and more importantly, with the forces that mold them. Furthermore, it's become evident, and more evident than ever before, that this can only be done through an interdisciplinary and collaborative spirit, and one that embraces the public sphere, and understanding that cities and their forms are integral to the prosperity of society at large. And for us to train professionals, designers, and planners who have the competence and character to exercise this leadership is really our mission. Thus, creating forums where these forms of interdisciplinary dialogues expose students to the many worlds, perceptions, and aspirations that shape cities and their regions and their situations and contexts is central to our mission. The Dunlop Lecture is one important forum that is intended to constitute such a dialogue. This lecture, established in 1999 with the Joint Center of Housing Studies, the National Housing Endowment, and the Harvard Graduate School of Design, is named after Professor Dunlop and his many significant contributions to the national housing community and field at large. And it's an occasion to bring together practitioners in the field, the general public, academics, students, as well as professionals entering the field. But most importantly, its intention is to stimulate a public dialogue as well as an awareness around the question of housing policy and design. Marc Morial, former mayor of New Orleans and now the president of the National Urban League, is an absolutely fitting lecturer to carry on this tradition. I very much look forward to Marc's addressal this evening, and I'm sure his vision for American cities will be inspiring to us all. With that, I'd like to sort of hand this over to Eric to introduce the other speakers. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Raul. I think you can see why we at the Graduate School of Design are just so pleased that Raul has joined us as the chair of the Urban Planning and Design Department. He brings an enormous energy, a great wealth of experience internationally, and a really practical understanding of what it takes to make and try to make cities work, and probably in one of the most interesting cities in the world where he's done a lot of his work, and didn't mention Mumbai, which for those who have visited is just a remarkable place. I'd now like to ask Bob Mitchell, who is a trustee of the National Housing Endowment, to come up and give a few words of welcome from the National Housing Endowment. The National Housing Endowment has been sponsoring the John T. Dunlop Lecture since its inception in 1999, and we thank you for your support over all these years and welcome you to welcome the group as well. Thank you.
As Eric said, my name's Bob Mitchell. I'm a home builder and developer. I'm very proud of it, to be very honest with you. And I come in from the Washington metropolitan area, more specifically Rockville, Maryland. But I am a trustee of the National Housing Endowment, and I am the year 2000 president of the National Association of Home Builders. We want to offer greetings on behalf of Gary Garzinski, our chairman, and all of our trustees for your being here tonight. We offer you greetings and thank you to discuss the issues of housing. They're very important to us, and we want more and more people to know about them. We have helped sponsor the, as Eric said, the Dunlop Lecture for many years, and the cooperation that we've had from Nick Racinitz and Eric is really very special, and we appreciate all that you guys have done to bring this together. This lecture honors our great friend John Dunlop. The Joint Center for Housing Studies and the National Housing Endowment founded this yearly lecture series on housing as a way to recognize and honor John's lifelong commitment to the housing industry. John served with distinction on the National Housing Endowment Board of Trustees, and he is certainly missed. We would like to take this opportunity to tell you just a little bit more about the National Housing Endowment. Created as the philanthropic arm of the National Association of Home Builders many years ago, the National Housing Endowment has raised $23 million from leaders all across all sectors, which is many, of the residential construction industry. These gifts have been made with one purpose: to invest in the future of an industry that worked hard to provide housing and communities for millions of American families. In turn, we have given over $9 million in grants to advance the areas of education, research, and training. Our current focus is our Home Building Education Leadership Program, otherwise HELP, H-E-L-P, which provides grants to two-year colleges and four-year universities. We began this program about 5 years ago. We've gotten up to where we have as many as 40 or 50 schools applying each year, and it's I can tell you because I experienced it, quite a task to judge them. But what we're trying to do is to further the education for residential construction management, which is so sorely needed. And we've now gone to approximately, I think it's about 12 schools, or maybe a little bit short there, but it's a $100,000 grant which they spread over 3 years, and they put it to good use. Tonight, we are honored to have Marc Morial, the President and CEO of the National Urban League. As Mayor of New Orleans, Mr. Morial ushered in a period of prosperity from 1994 to 2002, which has resulted in lowering crime, encouraging economic growth, and reinvesting in the city's older neighborhoods, and thereby inspiring a resurgence of urban living. He has also brought professional basketball back to New Orleans with the Hornets, when you lost the Jazz. Since 2003, Mr. Morial has served the National Urban League as its leader and guiding force. Through many programs, Mr. Morial is encouraging entrepreneurship in urban communities and empowering residents with the skills needed to improve their lives and their neighborhoods. So on behalf of the trustees of the National Housing Endowment, of which Mr. Nick is right here, he's one of them, I extend greetings to all of you and thank you for being here for the 11th Annual National Housing Endowment John T. Dunlop Lecture. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob. And I'd like to also mention Bruce Silver, who's served the National Housing Endowment for a number of years with distinction, who's also here tonight. I thought I'd call up, before introducing Marc and getting on to the presentation, Nick Ritsinas, who is a former director of the Joint Center for Housing Studies and a longtime friend of Marc, to give a few personal observations about Marc before I go through a little bit more of a formal view of what Marc has achieved and accomplished. Nick?
Good evening, everyone. First of all, isn't Eric off to a great start as director of the Joint Center? It's great to be with you this evening, to see friends from the Policy Advisory Board. I heard you had a great meeting this afternoon. I wish you had better news from that meeting that you could share with me. I have suggested that we move the reception before the roundtable next year. I also want to thank the National Housing Endowment, Bob and Bruce, among others, for your consistent support over time. When Eric first came up with the idea of our guest speaker, he asked me what I thought. I said I thought it was a grand slam. I don't think Eric knew how well I knew our speaker, so I just want to share just an observation or two about the treat that is in store for you tonight. I first met Marc when he was the mayor of New Orleans. Even before Katrina, New Orleans was challenged, but in his public service as mayor, he literally hit the trifecta. The unemployment rate went down, the crime rate went down, the poverty rate went down. It really was a masterful job. So masterful that it led to our second intersection. He was recognized by his peers to become president of the United States Conference of Mayors at the beginning of this decade. And it was an auspicious moment. It was 2001. We all sadly remember September 11th, 2001, when we were all tested. Cities up in the forefront of that battlefield. And Marc, through his leadership, led the way for the rebound that eventually became the progress that we made since that tragedy. For the last 7 years, he has served this country as an advocate, as a spokesman, as a visionary. He serves as president and CEO of the National Urban League. As many of you know now, I spend most of my time on the other side of the river. And the reason I mention that is if you walk along the tunnels of the business school, and a number of you are business school graduates, so you recall this, there is a gold-plated engraving that quotes Daniel Webster. And it quotes Daniel Webster as saying, "Credit is the vital air of modern commerce." I think what Marc Morial has taught us is that access to credit is the vital air for families, the vital air for neighborhoods, the vital air for our communities. So I'm pleased to join in welcoming my good friend, Marc Morial. Marc, welcome.
Well, I think you can already get the sense that Marc has had a remarkable career, so I'll only add a few observations about some moments of his career and then talk about the role he currently plays as the president and CEO of the National Urban League. Among other things, when Marc left the office of mayor, he left with a 70% approval rating. I don't think many politicians ever crack 60 or 65. To get to 70, maybe when you first come into office is a great number, but to leave with those kind of numbers speaks of the remarkable job that Marc did when he was a mayor of New Orleans. Nick mentioned some of the amazing accomplishments when Marc was mayor there, but I think I'd add to it that it's often been described, that period, as the New Orleans Renaissance, really bringing a place that people had thought of in one way to a very different place by the time that he left office. Of course, the city faced enormous challenges and tragedies ahead that have really altered literally the landscape of the city and the politics of the city and the economics of the city. But just an amazing achievement. And really, that was a platform for Marc to really get onto, I think, a national stage, which is where he most and best belongs. Marc really is a remarkably eloquent spokesperson for urban issues in America, for civil rights in America, for civic society in America, and really for a moral compass to guide what we do in the United States, pointing out that what we do that's right is not only right but good, and achieves much better outcomes for the broader society, and has really put his shoulder to that oar over the last number of years. For those of you who have heard Marc, you'll know that he's also a very interesting and visionary person who speaks eloquently about the things that he cares about, and he's agreed tonight to deliver a lecture to us that looks both at where we've been, because it's always important to understand your history, to understand where you need to go, but really trying to say, where do we need to go? And at this moment, to have someone of Marc's caliber, seriousness, thoughtfulness, breadth of experience address those topics around housing and urban America is just a very, I think, important moment for us all. So we really are pleased, really are very delighted, and very much looking forward to hearing what Marc has to say. Marc has agreed to take questions after his presentation, so we will take questions, so if you should start thinking about them as you hear him speak. But Marc, thanks so much.
First of all, good evening. Good evening. I'm proud to be here, and let me first just say thank you to Nick, who has been not only a friend, but really an eloquent champion of home ownership and an intelligent approach to housing policy. Thank you so much. And Eric, as you hit the ground, you're standing on some powerful shoulders, but you've also got a posse around you. You've got a crew around you, and everyone needs that as they assume a position of leadership. I also want to thank the business leaders and the home builders who are here. And I'll have a little bit more to share with you later about some thoughts about your very important role in moving this nation from where we are, certainly to where we need to be. To be asked to deliver this lecture and to learn that great Americans like Henry Cisneros and Jack Kemp, two men from opposite sides of the aisle who I have learned so much from, the late Jack Kemp now, gave this lecture. Bart Harvey, who of course is someone with whom I've worked, it makes tonight very, very special for me. So thank you so much for having me. And I join in honoring Secretary and Professor John Dunlop, for whom this lecture is named. It's also special to be here on this campus in Cambridge, across from Boston, just a shade before the 50th anniversary of the inauguration of President Kennedy next year in 2011. And the reason why is one of my most favorite quotes from John F. Kennedy was that we in America, we in the United States, must do things because they are hard and not because they are easy. And he used that quote as he prepared the nation and as he offered his vision for putting a man on the moon before the conclusion of the decade of the 60s. And I think what we face now when it comes to rebuilding the economy, and that includes housing and rebuilding this nation, is a hard task. It is not an easy, simple task. And if we think it's easy, and if we think it's simple, and if we think the answers are just before us, we will not do it, and we will not do it well. So I come tonight also as the 8th president of the National Urban League. And you've probably heard about the National Urban League, but there's some things I want to share. We're 100 years young. We celebrate our 100th year this year in 2010. And we're the civil rights organization most dedicated to economic empowerment, housing, jobs, and entrepreneurship. But we also served in 2009 2.1 million people. And that includes 70,000 people that we provided housing counseling services to. And I share that with you because we like to think of ourselves not as a think tank, not as a talk tank, but as a do tank, as a nonprofit, civil rights mission-driven organization that's on the ground serving people. So when I share my thoughts tonight, I share it with the experiences I've learned from being on the ground, being in the trenches, being in communities, understanding where policy and politics and people and economics really intersect and how it impacts the lives of the people in this nation. So as Nick and Eric mentioned, I had a great opportunity to serve as mayor of my own hometown, New Orleans, Louisiana. I also had the special privilege of being a second-generation mayor. My father was the mayor of New Orleans. He was the first African-American mayor of New Orleans, elected in 1977. And I say that because I grew up believing intimately and passionately that government and public service could make a difference in the future of this nation. Not solve every problem, not wave a magic wand, but can be indeed a force for good. And I'm very passionate about that because notwithstanding anything we might hear and see in the political discourse of this nation, I believe that the public sector can be a force for good. I believe that the private sector can be a force for good. And I believe that the nonprofit sectors can be a force for good. And that what intelligent leadership in this day and age is about is how to meld together the forces of all three to solve the very difficult problems that we face. Now, one thing I want to do as we begin is set the record straight on a few things. But let me take one step back and ask you to examine this first decade of the new millennium and examine all that we have been through as a nation and what this world has been through. And if you go all the way back to December of 1999, which is almost 11 years ago, the national obsession was Y2K. You all remember that national obsession? Now, that national obsession today seems trivial, seems unimportant, seems trite. We were worried about whether or not when we got on our elevator, it would get stuck between floors. We worried about whether our watches and computers would operate and whether our technology systems would crash. We not only worried about it, we had strategic plans on it. We hired a lot of consultants to help us with it. We had task forces, we had war rooms, and that was the national obsession at a time when home ownership was rising, when the unemployment rate was at a historic low, when the inflation rate was down, and when it seemed like prosperity and economic growth was going to be endless and infinite. And then the new millennium began. And it began as it began, we experienced a presidential election in 2000 that challenged our confidence in the integrity of the election system. The only election in the history of the nation that ended up in the United States Supreme Court. And if that was the only event of an unusual nature that would have happened in the first decade of the new millennium, it would have generated chapters in history books, biographies and autobiographies. But then, less than a year later, the awful strike on the towers took place, 9/11. And then we found ourselves involved in 2 wars. And then Hurricane Katrina exposed poverty that I knew and many of you know, but that many Americans thought was a thing of the past. And we saw governmental ineptitude at the federal, state, and local level that challenged, shocked us, angered us, and cost people their lives. And if all had stopped at that point and the rest of the decade were normal, we would have said that the first decade of the new millennium was extraordinary, unusual, historic, epic in its proportions in the events that took place. But then there was a subprime crisis and the Great Recession. And then we elected an African-American president. It has been a decade, as Time magazine described it, from hell in many ways. Or it's been a millennium that has begun with great misery. And it is very, very important as we step away and we think about the challenge of going from where we are to where we need to go, that we recognize all of the great challenges and difficulties that we faced in this decade and how it has affected the lives of people, how it has shaken our confidence in institutions, and why the path beyond is so long. So I'm going to do 3 things tonight. In setting the record straight, I want to talk to you about the weapons of mass deception. And the weapons of mass deception have been a part of the discussion about the housing and subprime meltdown. In 2008, I was invited to testify before Senator Chris Dodd's committee on the subprime crisis and on the subprime meltdown. At that time, the news was being filled with talking points and a narrative that the reason for the subprime crisis was the Community Reinvestment Act, that the reason for the subprime crisis was Fannie and Freddie, that the reason for the subprime crisis was that we decided to lend to unworthy, low-income Black and Latino borrowers. And like we always try to do at the National Urban League, we said, let's go do a little examination of the facts. Let's go see what, in fact, the truth is. It is a myth that the Community Reinvestment Act, Fannie and Freddie distorted the housing credit system and caused the economic crisis. Now, Fannie and Freddie did participate in the crisis by purchasing risky subprime securities that resulted in huge losses, but they didn't cause it. The meltdown was caused in large part by the proliferation of risky subprime loans originated by deregulated lenders, sold off by securities firms into subprime mortgage pools and abetted by rating agencies that failed to do their job. Now, here's the truth. Prior to the early 2000s, Fannie and Freddie's underwriting criteria did not allow no-doc loans. did not allow loans without an escrow for taxes and insurance, and required most borrowers to secure housing counseling or home buyer education. The introduction of new investors into the secondary market placed competitive pressures on Fannie and Freddie, and they changed their underwriting rules. And I mean not to exonerate Fannie and Freddie, but I do think that it is important as we have a discussion about the GSEs and the housing finance market that someone stand up and say, throw away your talking points, politicians and others. Let's go find out what really happened. Let's put an MRI. Let's go put an X-ray. Let's do a true examination of the crisis. Myth number 2, the Community Reinvestment Act requires banks and thrifts to make loans to unqualified, low-income, and minority borrowers. CRA does not. It states clearly that lending must be consistent with safe and sound banking practices. Studies by Treasury and the Fed that show that the CRA has significantly improved the availability of fair and affordable credit and services without negatively affecting safety and soundness. There is no evidence that the Community Reinvestment Act caused the subprime crisis. Now here's the point. Most subprime loans were not made to people of color. 58%, this is HMDA data, of higher cost loans were made to white borrowers, and fewer than 30% of subprime loans in 2006 were made to low and moderate income borrowers. Many people that took out subprime loans were people who already owned their homes, who were refinancing their home either to get money or to get into a new, larger home. That is the fact. That is what the data, in fact, shows. And it's very important as we try to remake this system that we separate myth, indeed, from fact. The other great tragedy of the mortgage meltdown is that many borrowers who were Black and Latino who met prime loan criteria were steered into the subprime market and therefore ended up with a higher cost, higher interest rate, less favorable term mortgage product. And these very important figures, these very important facts have to be a component and part of the discussion of how we remake, how we rebuild, how we reinvent housing in this nation. A couple of things that I think is important is as we talk about the weapons of mass deception, I do think it is also important for us to step all the way back to just the months and days and years after World War II, when the people of this nation, after that war, after that successful but costly war, when this nation put its might, its muscle, and the lives of so many on the line to defeat Hitler and defeat Hirohito, when the federal government took on massive debt in order to do it, they decided that this nation needed to be rebuilt. And one of the central features of that rebuilding was the creation of a robust opportunity for people to own their homes. And so we had the expansion of the FHA. We had Fannie. We had Freddie. We had the low-income housing tax credit, Section 8 vouchers, the creation of the Department of Housing and Urban Development, the rise of city planning and urban studies as a recognized discipline, the entrance into home building of nonprofit developers, indeed the growth of a home builder community, people whose business it was to figure out how to build housing, how to build it so it was affordable, how to mass produce it. These were features of the second half of the 20th century. And all of the evidence shows that because of that, the nation was better off. People were less likely to live in slums with no plumbing, with poor conditions, in unhealthy conditions. This nation was rebuilt in a significant way after World War II because of the government's emphasis combined with the private sector's ingenuity on building housing. So I think it's important, again, lessons learned, when we talk about where to go in the 21st century, to not only remember the subprime crisis, not only to remember the excesses that took place, but also to balance that with the great successes of home ownership. My own parents, my father, a Korean War veteran, my mother, educated in this city at Boston University, returned to New Orleans, and because of a VA loan, had an opportunity to buy their own home as a young couple and raise 5 children. And there are so many stories like that, indeed, across the nation. So let me offer a few thoughts, because I think the weapons of mass deception have to be confronted with what I want to call Operation Enduring Prosperity. And these are going to be steps that I suggest we take as a nation to confront our housing needs. Number one, we need a definitive annual forecast of what this nation's housing needs are. And we need to segment it into affordable, low income, very low income, luxury. We need a definitive forecast, not a 1-year forecast, not a 5-year forecast, but a 25-year forecast and a 50-year forecast, looking at population growth, looking at family trends, looking at geographic moves within the country. We need a definitive housing forecast. We need to know how many units of housing, roughly, we need to build, we need to create to keep up with the growth of the nation's population. And I don't think that forecast can be owned only by the government or only by the private sector or only by a think tank. It needs to be a consensus forecast, and we can develop a mechanism in order to do that, and then update it each and every year. We need to know how many units for home ownership we roughly need to build, how many units of rental housing we roughly need to build. We need to understand the production and the supply side of the equation. And I think this is where the public, private, and nonprofit sectors can come together. Number two, every lesson we've learned is that you can't just build housing, you have to build neighborhoods. And neighborhoods include commercial development, they include parks and schools and health facilities. One of the biggest challenges in New Orleans post-Katrina is that in many sections of the city, the Ninth Ward and New Orleans East, there are no hospitals. There's not a single hospital. So what does that mean? That means that older, medically needy people do not want to return to those neighborhoods. That in and of itself depresses the values of the homes in that area. That in and of itself makes banks less likely to want to invest. That in and of itself puts a drag on the interest that retailers might have in that area. That in and of itself creates a crisis of confidence that that particular community or those neighborhoods will come back. We must build neighborhoods, not just housing in the 21st century. Number three, we must invest in best practices And not only best policy practices, but best design practices, best building practices, best layouts. We need to think about what kind of houses we need in the 21st century. What has the recession done? One of the things the recession has done is it has multiple generations of families living under one roof. By necessity, a person may lose their home, one person may lose their job, they may go back in and move with the parents may go move with them. Single women who have children living together. A different kind of unit. And I think that the design and the building of homes, we need to invest in what that consumer, what that cluster of consumers wants and demands from the housing market. You know, it was not uncommon in a lot of parts of the nation where doubles were built, where you had 2 units in one structure. The idea would be that maybe 2 parts of the family or 2 generations of the family could live side by side. Maybe it was that one family lived on one side and the other side was rented out to generate enough income to pay the mortgage. We need to look and not be fixated on what we built in the 20th century. That, to me, again, is something where the government, the private sector, and the nonprofit sector can and should work together to imagine and think. It's where the design schools, it's where city planners, it's where what is the correct size of the house? What are the technology needs of the house? How much yard space? What do we build? What can we build? How do you size it correctly? I think we have to invest anew in best practices. A couple of policy ideas that I want to share with you to jumpstart sustainable growth. The Section 8 voucher program is very popular in some portions of the country, not so popular in other portions of the country because of what it represents in some areas where there's not strong enforcement when it comes to the conditions that people live in. And this is not a totally new idea, but I think we should make the Section 8 voucher program a convertible program, meaning I think we should allow people after some period to be able to convert what in effect is a government subsidy into a down payment on a home, to make it convertible, to tie that conversion to home buyer education, to housing counseling, so that people who participate in the program, who we can transition to home ownership, can do it in an orderly process, because I think that home ownership still has to be one of the most important objectives of housing policy in this country. Number 2, I think that the tax code is still a very important incentive when it comes to the direction and decision-making of private capital. I'd like to see Congress and the President look at creating a zero capital gains tax rate for investment in affordable housing in distressed areas, to create a super incentive to try to attract private capital into distressed urban areas to build the kind of housing that we need. And I think it would be a fair trade-off to say you have a zero capital gains tax rate if you invest in and hold a piece of real estate for a specific purpose for some limited period of time. Number 3, what we have in this nation currently is, and Nick and Eric, you would probably know the number better than I do, 1 million plus REOs and flying north on a steep trajectory. A lot of homes that are going to end up in the portfolios of banks to such an extent where now some financial services companies are saying, I don't want to foreclose on all these homes because I don't want to be responsible for all this property. And secondly, I don't want to take the risk that by foreclosing, I'm going to place more borrowers upside down. We need an initiative to put those properties back into commerce, to see that not as a problem. So we need, in effect, some sort of urban homesteading program or a homesteading initiative. Most people, probably because our history is just not that clear, may not remember that the nation back in the 1860s created a homesteading program. That homesteading program literally gave away property to anyone who would live on it, squat on it, build on it, farm on it. I heard a number that as many as 25% of all Americans today could trace their family wealth, family roots, all the way back to the urban homesteading program. We are involved at the National Urban League in a great initiative called the National Community Stabilization Trust. It's brought together 6 leading nonprofit organizations: LISC, Enterprise, Neighbor Works, the National Housing Partnership, the National Urban League, and the National Council of La Raza, in partnership with many financial services companies to try to create initiatives so that these properties that are held by banks can be guided back into commerce, some to be developed by nonprofit housing developers. Number 4, we've recommended to the Congress, to the President, and I would restate it again here, that we should look at creating green empowerment zones to spur new home building in distressed urban areas. Let me tell you one of the things that really, really gets into my craw as someone that loves urban communities and realizes that we need jobs in this country. I went out to Portland, Oregon, and visited a solar panel manufacturing facility. That solar panel manufacturing facility had about 100 employees in it. It had just been sold to a German company. And the gentleman said to me, if we are not careful, we're going to create a new type of energy dependency. We're going to promote green, and we're going to buy all our solar panels from abroad. Why can't we create incentives to put people to work in this nation, in distressed urban communities, use the tax code, use the regulatory code, use any package of incentives so that the wind turbines and the solar panels that people champion are built right here in Boston or in Baltimore or in New Orleans or in Chicago. Why can't we do that? Why should we promote green and then see all the green jobs go someplace else? This is a time for some sensibility, and a time when if we can match our public policy, if we can match our environmental policy, we can match our job policy and align them for the 21st century. Number 5, the low-income housing tax credit has been a successful program. The people who build housing cannot get enough of these tax credits. But there are some challenges with the utilization of the credit. We suggest the creation of a new workforce housing tax credit, which would create an incentive to increase the supply of housing for teachers, firefighters, police officers, public sector workers, and service sector workers who may not meet the income thresholds of the low-income housing tax credit. Not to replace that program, but to supplement that program. And again, these incentives need to be matched with a housing forecast. If we had a sensible long-term housing forecast, then we could align the incentives we need with the type of housing that we need to build. We need a much more sensible, careful, thoughtful, and this is business-like. Any smart business person does forecasts. They do market surveys. They look at what is needed. And I think if we're going to rebuild this housing market, we absolutely need to do the same. Number 6, we believe that any borrower who avails himself of a federally insured or guaranteed subsidized mortgage should participate in home buyer education training, housing counseling. The numbers are so clear. Where people participated in pre-purchase housing counseling, they were far less likely to sign on to a bad loan. They were far less likely to be tricked into a high interest rate loan. They were much more likely to take a step back and say, I'm not ready. They were much more likely to avoid the pitfalls, of course, absent the fact that we've got a new set of foreclosures taking place in this country because people have lost their jobs. We think that financial education, financial literacy, in this space it's called housing counseling, ought to be a mandatory feature wherever the taxpayer's money is put at risk to guarantee or insure a mortgage. And I can guarantee you that the success rates and the performance rates of those loans will be higher. Fannie and Freddie, remember, when they got rid of their housing counseling as an underwriting requirement, is one of the reasons why many of the pitfalls and problems took place. Number 7, the Consumer Protection Financial Bureau, which is the new agency created by bank reform, provides a great opportunity to do some very significant things. But I'm cautious about it because to stand up a new agency from scratch is something that we have not done in this country in a long time. And while it is an amalgamation of pieces of other agencies, it is in effect a new agency with a new mission, with new leadership, with a new building, with new employees, with new rules, with new letterhead, with a new website. It's going to take time, and there's going to be a period of uncertainty. But I do think it gives us an opportunity to create some important protections which, if done right, can help us rebuild the housing market and rebuild housing in this nation. The final thing I would say in terms of very specific recommendations for Operation Enduring Freedom is the need to not sweep under the rug the challenges we faced when it comes to the way in which African American and Latino borrowers and consumers were treated in the meltdown. And I think it is so critical and so important that we create rules, regulations, and enforcements and best practices, because we're in the 21st century. We're at a time when half of the population of this nation in 35 to 40 years will be people of color, and will become a nation that is made up of diverse peoples from all over. I would say to you that it is a good business practice to prepare this changing population to become intelligent consumers, good homeowners, good renters, and to provide confidence in the system, that the system is going to treat them fairly and give them a fair shake. And my final word tonight is a little bit about the GSEs. There's a discussion underway about what should happen with Fannie and Freddie. Here's where we come down. I believe that there is a continuing need for a dynamic, strong role for the government in the architecture that will emerge from GSE reform. I also believe that there has to be a new system created, not a hodgepodge of organizations that somehow are running around, fighting with each other, confusing the marketplace. We need to create a system, and in doing that, we've got to remember all the good that Fannie and Freddie produced, as well as all the problems that they participated in. Where that will lead, I am not certain at this time. But I do believe that a dynamic role for government is so critical at a time when capital markets are international, and they're no longer domestic. And we have to recognize what we do here has to be looked at in comparison to what the housing system will look like in other parts of the world. Because if there's a greater confidence that when capital is invested in other nations, that there are protections and there are guarantees in place, it will not sap, but it certainly will place and make the United States not as competitively attractive as some other international markets. So what's changed now in the 21st century is that the capital markets are indeed global. And any system we put in place has to be cognizant of that, has to recognize that the Atlantic is not a wall, the Pacific is not a wall, that the northern border or the southern borders are not a wall, and this is somehow a self-contained economy or a self-contained housing market. So tonight, I've taken this opportunity to try to share with you some thinking about the future with some very precise ideas. And I leave you with this thought. I think that rebuilding the nation's economy is the challenge of this generation of Americans. And I think that this generation of Americans has to embrace this challenge in a very forthright way. And I believe very passionately that we were the generation that got hold of the baton after a lot of hard work had been done. And that was the hard work of the Industrial Revolution. That was the hard work of the fight in World War II. That was the hard work of civil rights and the efforts towards gender equality. All of that hard work were done. The grounds were laid. The foundation was laid by generations before us. And what came in the aftermath was times of challenge, but also times of prosperity. And now here we are. And we do not want to be, and I know I do not want to be, part of a generation that hands the baton to my son and two daughters at a place in the race that is behind where it was handed to me. So we have to embrace this challenge and confront mistakes, but also understand the successes in building anew. It's not going to be easy. It's going to be hard. It's not going to be able to be undertaken by the government alone or by the private sector alone or by this politician or this political party alone. And perhaps therein lies the greatest challenge confronting us. Can we get together? Can we build bridges? Can we understand that we are in a boat and we're all in it together? Thank you. I didn't do one thing. Yeah, I forgot to do the most important thing. I brought my good luck charm tonight, my wife, Michelle Miller. Thank you.
Well, Mark, we asked you for a vision. You gave us a clear vision. We asked you to be inspirational. You were inspirational. We asked you to be thoughtful. You were thoughtful. We asked for you to be insightful. You were insightful. We asked you to give us a lot to chew on. You gave us a lot to chew on. So I really thank you very much for those words. I think you put things in an excellent context. I think at the beginning of your remarks, when you were talking about weapons of mass deception, it reminded me of the adage that you're entitled to your own opinions, but not your own facts. And I think there's going to be a lot of debate and discussion around facts moving forward. And I think you put your finger on a very important one, which will be really what lessons do we take from what happened, and it's really critically important to take lessons that are informed by fact. So I really appreciate that. I think there was obviously a lot in what you had to say. We always like to hear someone, and we didn't script you to do it, say that we need a definitive forecast of where we're going. That's kind of our stock and trade, but I think it is important to know where you're going so you know how to plan for it. Marc has agreed to take questions from the audience, so we'll entertain some. So why don't we start over there? Marc?
My name is Ann Lusk. My PhD is in architecture, and I'm a research associate at the Harvard. My name is Ann Lusk. My PhD is in architecture. I'm a research associate at the Harvard School of Public Health. I want to ask if you would add to your policy list one more. The cost for obesity is rising out of sight. We do not align housing with obesity. We have aligned housing with public health in the past, the social reform movement, the disease, pestilence, and morbidity in New York City. As you mentioned, after World War II, zoning, better code regulations for homes. It is physical activity washing when we create new urbanist developments, because research we've conducted on the Nurses' Health Study showed that 50% of the nurses walk slowly and they gain weight. So walking environments do not control obesity. We also know that in parks, we don't really control obesity, because if you look at the physical activity of the people in the parks, most of them are sedentary. Bicycling, the Dutch, they significantly control weight, and yet we never align a bicycle with the apartment complex, the affordable housing complex, even the expensive housing. I'm now working in Roxbury, Mattapan, and Dorchester to better address crime and the bicycle. And I will interview about 100 gang members and 100 church parent-teacher individuals to ask them their perception about different bicycle environments. How do we align obesity and housing and the bicycle to go forward?
Great, that's great. I want to ask you, anything you could point to that's a best practice in that space?
In Roxbury, Mattapan, Dorchester, we haven't done it yet. If I get a large NIH grant, I would also study physical activity in Harlem as well as in Orlando. The cycle tracks are the best, but in Orlando, in the low-income African-American neighborhoods, they haven't taught the people how to bicycle on the facilities that they've put in. So you can't put just a bicycle lane in, you need to put the bicycle symbol and the arrow. In Roxbury, Mattapan, Dorchester, in looking at the 15 streets where there were shootings, 11 of the streets are one-way, double parking, parallel parking on both sides, and sidewalks and triple deckers. Perfect environment from an environmental psychology standpoint for shootings. We could put bicycle facilities there. We could also make the streets, again, two-way to lessen the shootings. So there are examples. We also have an article coming out, we hope, in injury prevention, 28% less risk to bicycle in a cycle track that's between the sidewalk and the parallel park cars compared to biking in the road.
No, thank you for those comments, and I appreciate the thought about how, health and obesity, which is an epidemic, should be integrated into how we rebuild cities. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Ryan Kennedy. I'm a student at the Harvard Kennedy School and also at the business school. And I also used to work a little bit in community development lending. So I was curious, in your operation...
Enduring prosperity.
Enduring prosperity. Just a little bit more about the role of credit that's going to play going forward. Because as you know, just basically from the meltdown, a lot of former subprime lenders have pulled back or have gone out of business. We've also seen the GSEs pulling back, raising credit standards, pushing a lot of, or eliminating the opportunity for low-income borrowers to get loans. So I'm just curious, how do we get responsible loans to low-income people in the future?
You know what I think? I think financial education and financial literacy and housing counseling is a very important part of this, so that people are empowered to make good decisions, number one. Number two, we have to figure out a way to help people get straight. What do I mean? Get straight means is you've probably got a lot of people in a mountain of bad credit reports, blemishes on their record. How do you create a way for people to get a new start so that they're bankable, so that they can borrow money is another thing, another important component. And I think the third important component is we need some best practices, we need some regulatory boundaries. I'll use the term regulatory boundaries on terms and interest rates so that you do not have the kind of mortgage products, the kind of credit card products, the kind of financial products that cause people to pay extraordinary amounts for money. I mean, this is basically, credit is just somebody selling money. That's all it is. You don't have money, I need to buy money to buy a thing. And the issue really is what people are charged for that money and the terms fair and balanced? And that to me is the product, the teaser rates, the high interest rates that there was no rhyme or reason to the song affected that. So I think there's a whole lot of work to do to help people, first of all, get straight. But let me tell you where financial counseling comes in. And housing counseling and financial education comes in. It helps people do things like have family budgets. It helps people understand the mix of savings and spending. Now, this is a longer conversation that we can't get into today. And the larger challenge for the American economy is that middle and working class people's incomes has not kept pace with inflation over the last 30 to 35 years. That's another discussion for another day and another lecture in another building here at Harvard. But it's a part you can't forget. Yeah, question over here.
Thank you, Mark. I think the comment that comes to mind for me is that we talk a lot about the individuals and educating the individuals, but what we lost over the past 8 to 10 years were the trusted institutions that can exist in the marketplace. And all these programs are fine when they're directed across the market cycle. And people have to understand, I think, institutions have to understand how to participate as a trusted institution in the marketplace so that when borrowers are, even the educated or uneducated ones, know where to turn to look for trusted institutions. When investors are looking to invest in product, they invest in products with structurers or issuers that are trusted institutions. When we get that in place, I think we have to look across the whole market and put all those pieces together.
No, it's a valid comment, and it's a larger discussion, but I do think that the compensation system for executives of public companies got way out of whack, and it rewarded short-term gain. I mean, I know a lot of people in the equity business who said, look, I'm trying to just get this deal. Because if I get this deal and I can flip this deal, here's what I'm going to make. I'm saying, suppose you stayed and grew it over the next 10 years. Nobody does that anymore. We created and it affects our politics, and it affects the way we think about business. We are an obsessed nation with election cycles, earnings cycles, and news cycles. And that's what we live by. For the public company CEO, it's what's my stock price now? What's next quarter's earnings? And that's what I'm concerned with. I'm not concerned about long-term health, long-term viability. Can I grow 5 to 7% over the next 5 to 7 years? No, I'm interested in fast. And that mentality creates the mindset in the working person, the middle-income person, the working person, the person who's out there struggling, that they've got no chance in the game. And that's when they distrust the institutions. And so we're in a cycle now, you know, there's a lot of static and polling taken on we don't trust the government. What I think Americans, where I think Americans are is not trusting big institutions, period. Government, private sector, with the exception, of course, of the nonprofit sector. Everybody still loves us. And I think that that is really something, and I think the compensation. I think what people are also going to see in politics, quite candidly, I think they're going to see so much money being spent. I mean, you have multi-millionaires running for office, spending, I'll spend $100 million. $100 million to get elected to a $180,000 job. $100 million to have that sort of power. And people look back, the little person looks back and says, it's just who has the most money. It's all about buying it. And I think that that's a value system, and sometimes people associate that value system with capitalism. That is not what Adam Smith had in mind. I can tell you, that's not the capitalism that the great Adam Smith and the invisible hand had in mind. He had something else in mind. So it's important that we not, we look at it with great perspective. And look, I believe in markets and I believe in capitalism, but I also believe that there's a very important role for the collective, and the collective is represented by the government and the public sector, for good or for bad. One more?
Thank you. With the federal government divided and state governments largely, fiscally challenged, what do you see as, specifically the city government's role in being dynamic and enacting, your vision and solving the problems that are confronting them, head on, because, who's going to do it,
I believe it would be, more emphasis should be placed on city governments, and more opportunities and resources should be given to city governments. And I believe that because I think that city governments, I think that our nation's leaders could learn a whole lot from the mayors of America. And I tell you why, because mayors do not have the luxury to operate with partisanship in mind from beginning to end of the day. They have to operate in multi-ethnic, diverse environments and find solutions. They're used to having everybody in their office fussing at them and debating and clamoring with each other. And you have meetings when you're at the local level, and over here you got a guy with a whole lot of money. Over here you got somebody who's got on jeans. Over there you've got an older person, and most cities do business in a very different way. It's not dominated by the lobbyists. It's not dominated by the paid. And I think our national leaders could learn a lot from the more basic way that local government is carried out, which is very authentic, very passionate, and very practical a great deal of the time. I believe that local governments need to be given more tools and more opportunity, and that's why I've long believed that this nation should have a local communities/urban policy perspective on so much of what we do. And I think we have gotten away from that, and I think we've moved away from that, and I think the role of the cities is a very important component to rebuilding the nation's economy.
Spoken like a mayor. So thank you for that.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Yes.
Thank you all. Appreciate you all. Thank you very much.
Join me in thanking Marc.
Thanks.